Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take these really dense foundational texts from different fields and, well, pull out the crucial insights you need to know.
That's the goal.
Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental. It's about understanding human difference itself. I mean, why is it that you might be super quick to react under pressure while, your friend just seems to shrug everything off?
Right. Or why some people actively seek out new, thrilling experiences and others really prefer sticking to a routine they know.
Exactly. These sort of core underlying differences. That's what scientists are talking about when they use the word temperament.
And we are really digging into one specific central chapter from a major psychiatry textbook, Kaplan and Sadock's. It's focused squarely on temperament, risk and protective factors for child psychiatric disorders.
Okay.
For a long time, clinical practice often viewed disorders as pretty black and white. You either have the illness or you don't. But the research now, it overwhelmingly shows that the relationship between, well, who you are fundamentally and the disorders you might develop it's incredibly complex.
So the question isn't if there's a link anymore.
Not really, no. The big question now is how. How does temperament actually interact with your environment developmentally over time to shape your mental health journey?
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. We're trying to understand the boundary, maybe it's more like a gradient, between these normal, healthy variations we all have and how clinical disorders actually form.
And to really get that boundary, you have to realize this whole idea of temperament. It's not new, not at all.
How far back are we talking?
We're talking ancient Greece, over 2,000 years back, to the physician Galen. He proposed 4 personality types: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, based on what he thought were 4 bodily humors.
Humors. Like blood and bile sounds pretty outdated.
It does, but here's the fascinating part. If you just mentally swap out those old humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood phlegm, for things we talk about today, like, say, serotonin levels or norepinephrine activity.
Ah, okay. The basic structure holds up.
Exactly. The underlying theory is remarkably similar. Your basic biology influences your fundamental emotional and behavioral leanings. That core idea is still with us.
But that biological focus kind of got lost for a while, didn't it? Early 20th century.
It did. You had psychoanalysis looking at childhood conflicts, and then behaviorism focusing purely on learning and environmental responses.
Yeah.
The biological roots of personality and difference, they got really blurred.
So who brought it back into focus?
The real turning point came in the 1950s. 2 child psychiatrists, Stella Chess and Alexander Thomas. They did this landmark observational study watching infants and kids, and they proposed 9 basic dimensions of temperament.
9 dimensions, okay.
And crucially, they noticed these dimensions tended to cluster. They identified 3 recognizable types: the easy child, the slow-to-warm-up child, and maybe the most famous one, the high-risk difficult child.
The difficult child, I've definitely heard that term. What was so radical about their work?
Well, their most profound argument, the one that really challenged the thinking at the time, was that these temperamental traits were substantially heritable.
Meaning genetic.
Meaning biology played a big role.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about parenting or the environment, which was the prevailing view. They were saying a child's predisposition to be difficult or easy had biological roots.
That must have been controversial.
Oh, definitely. But it laid the groundwork for how we define temperament today. There's a sort of consensus now. For a trait to count as temperament, it generally needs to meet 3 key criteria.
Okay, what are they?
First, heritability. There has to be some clear genetic influence. It doesn't have to be 100% genetic, but genes have to be involved.
Got it, heritable.
Second, early appearance. These traits need to be noticeable, evident, way back in infancy or toddlerhood. They're not things that just appear in adolescence.
Visible early. Makes sense.
And third, stability. This means the traits are moderately consistent across many years. Now, it's not destiny. Temperament isn't fixed like concrete, but there's a definite thread of continuity.
Okay, so heritable, shows up early, and reasonably stable over time. That seems clear.
It provides a solid framework.
But here's where it gets tricky for clinicians, right? Researchers see temperament as fundamentally dimensional. We all fall somewhere on a spectrum for these traits.
Exactly. Like height or blood pressure.
But the main diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, it still mostly uses a disease model, doesn't it? It often pushes for a yes-no decision. Does the person have this specific illness or not?
That's the core tension. The DSM is largely categorical, while temperament research is dimensional. And researchers are constantly grappling with this boundary problem.
Right. So is that kid who's incredibly active just way out at the high end of the normal activity spectrum? Or is there something fundamentally different going on, a distinct disorder?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads us right into the current ways of thinking about temperament dimensions. Those original 9 dimensions from Chess and Thomas, they've largely been refined and consolidated.
Into fewer, broader categories.
Yeah, into a few core high-level traits that show up consistently across different studies and theories. You can think of them as maybe 3 major dimensions, almost like the core systems of your psychological engine.
Okay, I like that analogy. What's the first one?
The first big one is usually called something like withdrawal and negative emotions. This reflects your basic sensitivity to threat, punishment, or frustration.
So how easily you feel anxious or sad or angry?
Precisely. Different theories call it negative affectivity or neuroticism or harm avoidance. It governs your threshold for those negative feelings. Biologically, it's strongly linked to the behavioral inhibition system, the BIS.
BIS, behavioral inhibition system. So that's like the brakes.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Your brain's brake pedal, how sensitive you are to potential danger or negative outcomes.
Okay, dimension 1, the brakes. What's dimension 2?
Dimension 2 is basically the opposite, approach and positive emotions. This is your go system, your motivation to engage with the world, particularly for potential rewards.
Ah, so this is about seeking out novelty, excitement, positive feelings.
Exactly. It gets labels like extraversion or novelty seeking or sensation seeking. It's the drive to explore, to experience things, to feel joy and excitement. And this one is tied to the behavioral activating system, or BAS.
BAS, the accelerator.
Yep, your psychological accelerator. How strongly you're drawn towards goals and rewards.
Brakes and accelerator. Makes sense. Is there a third?
There is, and it's arguably one of the most critical for long-term outcomes. Emotional regulation and constraint, sometimes called effortful control or persistence or conscientiousness.
This sounds like self-control.
It is. It's the brain's executive function at work. The ability to manage your impulses, to stay focused on a goal even when it's hard or boring, to resist distractions, to plan ahead.
So if the BIS is the brakes and the BIS is the accelerator, what's this one? The steering wheel.
That's a perfect analogy. It's your ability to manage the brakes and the accelerator effectively to steer your behavior towards longer-term goals, rather than just reacting in the moment. Low levels here mean you're more impulsive, distractible, maybe disorganized.
Got it. Brakes, accelerator, steering, that helps picture it. You also mentioned a specific trait earlier, BI.
Right, behavioral inhibition, or BI. It's worth highlighting because it's been studied so extensively. It's not quite a full dimension, more like a specific pattern seen in about 10–15% of kids.
And what does it look like?
These are the children who consistently react to new things, new people, unfamiliar situations, novel objects with immediate fear, caution, and withdrawal. They hang back, they're quiet, they might cling to a parent.
Okay. And you said it's linked to anxiety.
Very strongly, especially social anxiety. We'll definitely come back to that link.
So we have these dimensions and this specific BI trait. Does the research also group people into broader types based on these traits, like Chess and Thomas did?
Yes, absolutely. Modern statistics allow for more sophisticated ways to find these groupings. They use techniques like latent profile analysis, basically, statistical methods, to see if people naturally cluster into distinct profiles based on their scores across these different dimensions.
Like finding hidden patterns.
Exactly. The chapter describes one study, and there's a figure illustrating it, figure 38:1, which found 3 common temperament types or profiles.
What were they?
Well, first, there was a moderate profile folks who were pretty much average across all the dimensions. Nothing particularly extreme.
Okay, the middle ground.
Then there was a profile they called steady. These individuals were low on novelty seeking, but high on persistence or effortful control. They weren't easily bored, they stuck with tasks. And this profile was generally associated with better outcomes, more resilience.
Steady sounds pretty good. What was the third?
The third was labeled disengaged, and this one looked problematic right from the profile. These individuals were high on novelty seeking and high on harm avoidance or negative emotions, but low on sociability or reward dependence.
Wait, high novelty seeking AND heart or avoidance? How does that work?
It's a tough combination, isn't it? They crave excitement and new things, high BAS maybe, but they're also very anxious and fearful of the potential negative consequences, high BAS. And they're not strongly motivated by social connection. That mix often leads to poor outcomes.
Yeah, you can see how that would be a difficult internal conflict. It paints a picture of risk based just on these stable traits. Which brings up stability. How consistent are these traits over a lifetime? And what's the hard evidence linking them to actual biology?
Good questions. The traits show moderate stability.
Mm,
They're definitely not set in stone, especially in early childhood, but they become more consistent as you age. And the more extreme a trait is, the more stable it tends to be.
okay, moderately stable. What about the biological footprint?
The physiological evidence is really quite striking. The chapter details this fascinating fMRI study. They brought in adults who, decades earlier, as 2-year-olds, had been identified as being behaviorally inhibited, that fearful, reticent group.
The BI kids, grown up.
Exactly. Years later, as adults, they put them in an fMRI scanner and showed them pictures of novel faces. Now, even if these adults reported feeling calm, even if they didn't consciously feel anxious,
What happened in their brains?
their amygdala, a key brain region involved in detecting threats and processing fear, showed significantly higher activity compared to adults who hadn't been inhibited as toddlers.
Wow, so decades later, even if they've learned to cope or manage their outward behavior, that underlying physiological alarm system is still more sensitive.
That's what it suggests. The initial automatic reactivity seems to linger, even if the outward regulation is improved. It's a powerful piece of evidence for a lasting biological basis.
That really drives home the biological link, and genetics play a role here too, obviously.
For sure, twin and adoption studies consistently show that genetic factors account for somewhere between 20% and maybe up to 60% of the variation we see in temperamental traits.
20 to 60%. That's a pretty wide range, but definitely significant.
It is. But here's something really interesting the chapter points out, a bit of a paradox.
Oh,
In some studies, the heritability, the estimated genetic influence, is actually lowest in infancy and then seems to increase as people get older.
wait, hang on. How can the genetic influence increase with age? If it's genetic, shouldn't it be strongest early on? That seems backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive at first glance, but it points to a really crucial concept:
Mm-hmm.
the interplay between genes and environment, specifically something called active gene-environment correlation.
Active gene-environment correlation. Okay, break that down.
As you grow older, your inherent temperamental predispositions, which are partly genetic, start to influence the choices you make and the environments you actively seek out or create for yourself.
So if I'm naturally high in, say, sensation seeking.
You're more likely to choose friends who are also risk takers, engage in high-stimulus activities, maybe pick a career that involves novelty and excitement. You actively select environments that match and reinforce your genetic predisposition.
And that reinforcement makes the trait stronger, or at least more consistently expressed, making it look like the genetic influence has increased over time.
Precisely. Your temperament shapes your environment, and then that environment feeds back and further shapes the expression of your temperament. It's a dynamic loop.
That makes sense. So the environment is obviously still critical.
Absolutely. And the chapter emphasizes that often it's the non-shared environmental factors that seem to have the biggest impact on shaping individual differences in temperament and personality.
Non-shared meaning.
Things that siblings living in the same family don't necessarily share equally, like having different peer group, unique life experiences, maybe a specific illness or a particularly influential teacher, or even accidents. These unique experiences often exert more influence on individual trait development than the shared environment, like the family's socioeconomic status or general parenting style, although those still matter, of course.
Interesting. So those unique experiences interact with these underlying biological systems.
Exactly. And we know quite a bit about the neurobiology now. For negative affectivity or harm avoidance, that sensitivity to threat, it's strongly linked to hyperreactivity in the amygdala, like in that fMRI study, and also involves the HPA axis.
The stress response system, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands.
Right, the body's main hormonal system for dealing with stress. For approach or novelty, seeking the accelerator that's heavily tied to dopamine pathways, especially in brain regions like the striatum, which are central to motivation and reward.
Dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter involved in drive.
Okay, and for emotional regulation or effortful control, the steering wheel that relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex, particularly areas like the anterior cingulate cortex. This is your brain's executive control center, modulating those deeper, more automatic emotional responses from subcortical regions like the amygdala.
So the thinking part of the brain managing the feeling part.
In essence, yes. There's even evidence for brain lateralization generally. More activity in the left frontal lobe is associated with approach and positive emotions, while more activity in the right frontal lobe is linked to withdrawal and negative emotions.
Fascinating. It makes total sense that the brain systems underlying these normal temperamental variations are the same ones implicated when things go wrong in psychopathology.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to that core boundary problem. How do we conceptually map the relationship between a temperamental trait and a clinical disorder?
Yeah, how do researchers think about that connection?
They generally propose four main models or hypotheses to explain how temperament might relate to psychopathology. The chapter lays these out clearly. I think it's table 38 of 4.
Okay, four models, what are they?
Well, the two most common ones are probably the spectrum or continuum model and the risk or vulnerability model.
Spectrum continuum.
Yeah.
That sounds like what we were saying earlier.
Pretty much. This model suggests that the disorder is simply the extreme dysfunctional end of a normal temperamental trait that exists on a continuum in the population.
Like very, very high anxiety being an anxiety disorder.
Or, the classic example often used is ADHD. The symptoms might just represent the extreme high end of normal dimensions like activity level or low effortful control. There's no sharp dividing line, just a gradual increase in severity and impairment.
Okay, that's one model. What's the risk vulnerability one?
This model proposes that the temperament trait and the disorder are qualitatively different things, but having a certain temperament increases your risk or vulnerability to developing the disorder later on, especially under stress.
So the trait isn't the disorder itself, but it makes you more susceptible.
Exactly. For example, being very high on novelty seeking doesn't automatically mean you'll develop a substance use disorder, but it might increase the likelihood that you'll experiment with substances, interact with peers who use them, and find the effects highly rewarding, thereby increasing your risk. The trait is a risk factor, not the disorder itself.
Okay, continuum and risk. Those seem like the main ways to think about it. What are the other two models?
The other two are the pathoplastic model and the SCAR model.
Pathoplastic.
Yeah, this model suggests that the temperament trait and the disorder are distinct, but the temperament influences the course, severity, or expression of the disorder once it develops.
How so?
For instance, someone high in effortful control might still develop depression, but that trait might help them adhere to treatment better, cope more effectively, and maybe have a better long-term prognosis compared to someone with depression who is very low on effortful control. The temperament shapes how the illness manifests and progresses.
It influences the outcome.
Okay.
And the last one, the SCAR model.
The SCAR model basically flips the causality. It suggests that the illness itself actually causes changes in personality or temperament.
The illness leaves a star on the personality.
That's the idea. The most common example is in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Often, changes in personality like increased apathy or irritability can be among the earliest signs, appearing even before significant memory loss. The disease process itself is altering the person's basic traits.
Right. Okay, those four models provide different lenses for understanding the link. How does this play out with specific disorders, like ADHD?
Well, for ADHD and other externalizing disorders like conduct problems, the links are pretty clear and often fit that spectrum model. ADHD is consistently linked to low effortful control persistence, that difficulty with the steering wheel, and often high extraversion novelty seeking, especially for the hyperactive impulsive presentation.
Makes sense. What about aggression?
The chapter makes an important distinction here, often linked back to temperament. It separates instrumental aggression from reactive aggression.
What's the difference?
Instrumental aggression is more cold, calculated, planned, and proactive, used to achieve a goal. It's sometimes associated with psychopathic traits, particularly type 1 psychopathy, and interestingly, often linked with an under-aroused autonomic nervous system.
Less reactive physiologically.
Right, whereas reactive aggression is hot, impulsive, defensive, and angry, lashing out in response to perceived threat or frustration. This type is more strongly linked to high negative affectivity and poor emotional regulation. The underlying temperamental drivers, and thus the treatment approaches, are quite different.
That's a crucial distinction. What about internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression?
For anxiety and mood disorders, the single strongest and most consistent temperamental link across the board is high negative affectivity harm avoidance. That high sensitivity to threat and negative emotion seems to be a core vulnerability factor.
A common soil from which these different disorders can grow.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And then specific traits might nudge things towards a particular disorder. Remember behavioral inhibition, BI, that early childhood reticence and fear of novelty?
Yeah, you said it was strongly linked to social anxiety.
Incredibly strongly. The chapter cites a meta-analysis, a study combining results from many previous studies, which found that about 43% of young children identified with stable BI went on to meet diagnostic criteria for social anxiety disorder later in life.
43%. Wow, that's a huge risk elevation. That's a very direct line from an early temperament trait to a specific psychiatric illness.
It's one of the most robust findings in the field, really highlighting that temperamental prediction.
So this brings us back to that interplay mechanism you mentioned earlier, the gene-environment correlation. The chapter uses a case study, right? Kayla.
Yes, the case of Kayla is a perfect illustration of how these genotype-environment correlations work in practice and how they can create a cycle leading to pathology.
Tell us about Kayla.
Kayla, as an infant, showed a difficult temperament. She was described as fearful, easily distressed by new things, and slow to approach anything unfamiliar. High BI, basically.
Okay, so starting with that predisposition.
Right. Now, critically, her mother also struggled with anxiety. So, Kayla's inherent temperamental fearfulness, you could think of that as her genotype influencing her behavior, didn't happen in a vacuum. It evoked a specific response from her environment, namely her anxious mother.
How did the mother respond?
She became extremely overprotective. She tried to shield Kayla from anything that might cause distress, new people, new situations, potential challenges. Her intention was good, of course, to protect her child.
But that backfired.
Completely. Because Kayla was constantly shielded, she never got the chance to encounter mildly challenging situations and learn to cope. She didn't get the necessary exposure to overcome her natural reticence. The overprotective environment, triggered by her temperament, ended up accentuating her initial fearfulness.
So the environment solidified the trait, making it worse.
Exactly. And this cycle, this feedback loop between Kayla's temperament and the evoked parenting style, directly contributed to her developing significant social anxiety and eventually depression later in childhood. It wasn't random. The environment was actively shaped by and then amplified her initial disposition.
That really shows how temperament and environment weave together. But it sounds kind of deterministic. Are you just stuck if you have a difficult temperament in a bad fit environment?
Not at all. And that's where the concept of goodness of fit comes in. It's the crucial counterpoint. The idea is that temperament traits aren't inherently good or bad in isolation. Their impact, whether they lead to problems or not, depends heavily on how well they fit with the demands, expectations, and opportunities of the environment.
So the context matters.
Hugely. The chapter highlights another study, illustrated in Figure 38-3, that demonstrates this perfectly. They looked at kids who were high in novelty seeking.
The accelerator kids.
Right. These kids only tended to develop significant attention problems if they also had a mother who was herself high in novelty seeking.
Wait, why would that pairing be problematic?
Well, the researchers speculated that maybe a high novelty seeking parent might create a more stimulating, less structured home environment, which could overwhelm a child also prone to seeking novelty and having difficulty with regulation. But here's the key. If the same high novelty seeking child had a mother who was low in novelty, seeking perhaps providing more structure and predictability.
The attention problems didn't develop as much.
Exactly. The problems were far less severe. The goodness of fit was better. The calmer parenting style or environment acted as a buffer, mitigating the potential risk associated with the child's temperament. The environment can turn a potential risk factor into a relatively neutral trait, or even a strength in some contexts.
So the clinical goal isn't necessarily to change the child's core temperament, which might be really hard anyway, but maybe to adjust the environment or the interaction patterns to create a better fit.
That's often the most effective approach. It's about breaking those maladaptive cycles we saw with Kayla.
How did that work for Kayla in the end? What did the treatment look like?
Well, recognizing that the mother-child interaction was this bidirectional reinforcing loop was key. So the treatment targeted both sides of that cycle.
Okay.
The mother received treatment for her own anxiety, including medication, which helped reduce her anxiety-driven, overprotective behaviors. She learned to step back a bit and allow Kayla more age-appropriate challenges.
And for Kayla?
Kayla received cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, specifically targeting her social anxiety. But importantly, they also focused on her strengths. She was skilled at playing the piano, so she was encouraged and supported to channel that skill into a positive, socially engaging outlet recitals, playing with others.
So they reshaped the environment and helped her build coping skills using her strengths.
Exactly. The treatment didn't try to fundamentally change Kayla's cautious nature, but it changed the environmental response to it and gave her tools to navigate it. It helped turn that cycle from a maladaptive one into a more adaptive one, allowing her temperament to express itself in a healthier way.
That makes a lot of sense. So, wrapping this all up, what's the big picture takeaway here?
I think the clearest takeaway is that the line we often imagine between a normal personality trait and a psychiatric illness is, well, it's incredibly blurry. It's often more of a continuum or a complex interaction.
Yeah, it's not a simple boundary.
And we've seen that what looks like a single disorder, say anxiety or aggression, might actually arise through different temperamental pathways for different people. For some, it might be more of a spectrum effect, just an extreme version of a trait. For others, it's clearly a vulnerability of the trait interacting with a stressful environment.
Understanding those different pathways seems crucial for treatment.
Absolutely. It's vital for identifying who might be at risk early on and for tailoring interventions.
Yeah.
If we know the underlying temperamental profile, we might be able to intervene much earlier and more effectively before a full disorder takes hold.
And maybe the focus shouldn't always be just on the problem traits.
That's the final provocative thought, isn't it? The research, particularly looking at profiles like that steady group, high in persistence, high in effortful control, suggests we have agency. Not necessarily over the raw traits we start with, but perhaps over how we cultivate certain skills and manage the environment.
So instead of only asking, how do we fix the illness after it appears, we can also ask, how can we proactively cultivate those temperamental aspects like persistence, like effortful control that seem to promote resilience and well-being, even when faced with adversity? How do we build the strengths that buffer against risk?
Focusing on wellness and resilience, not just illness, that's a powerful shift in perspective.
It really is. It moves us towards prevention and optimizing potential.
Well, thank you for guiding us through that complex terrain. It really highlights the fascinating interplay between who we are fundamentally, our environment, and our mental health journey.
My pleasure. It's a crucial area of understanding. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel more informed and equipped to think critically about this vital intersection of temperament and psychopathology.